I'm Deborah Hoffman, and along with IWF Florida Forum Live and Learn co-chair Kareen Shahab and our team member Kimberly Marshall, welcome you to tonight's IWF program titled The Impact of Local and Global Climate Change. This important and timely program is a collaborative effort between IWF Florida Forum and IWF Suncoast. Tonight's program was developed by Ruth Brophy, who's a member of both forums, along with the collaboration of Beth Gottheld from the Suncoast and Michigan forums, and as well with our panelists. They've all worked for a number of months to bring you tonight's conversation. Ruth is a senior advisor with the private equity firm HIG Capital and a board member of a number of community organizations. Beth is the program chair for IWF Suncoast Forum, a board member of the Michigan and the Suncoast Forums, and is an environmental attorney with the law firm Butzel Long. She's the co-chair of the firm's environmental and sustainability practice. Beth will help moderate the program and field questions. And now over to you, Ruth.
Thanks, Debbie. Tonight, for your viewing, we're using the advanced Zoom webinar software due to the large number of attendees. Therefore, you will only be able to see the panelists and their discussion on the screen. Please put your questions in the chat section or use the raise your hand symbol during the question period. This program is being recorded for future viewing. Unfortunately, Leisha John, a previously announced panelist, is unable to attend because she is delayed in Italy with COVID. But she has reached out to have a great environmental specialist take her place. I'd like to introduce you to Alex Moreira. He is Managing Director for International Financial Consulting Limited, a leading climate and development finance consulting firm working in all continents. He currently helps financial institutions, multilateral banks, and government agencies implement climate strategies and finance their sustainable development goals. Next, we have Ellen Getz as our panelist. Ellen is a new member of IWF Suncoast and is a well-known landscape architect. She is vice chair of the board of the Everglades Foundation and has been involved with them for many years. As promised, we also have a special guest, Pablo Angulo Triconis, who is from the Aspen Institute. The Institute is a group of nonpartisan experts who bring people together to address some of the world's most complex problems, like climate change, and to help to do the most good for the greatest number of people. Pablo will share with us some takeaways from the recently held climate conference in Miami Beach. Beth, we're ready to go.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, everyone. And somebody asked if the cameras are on or not, and also whether you're muted. So for participants, no, we can't see you. Your cameras are off. So it's okay if you didn't get your hair done. And, or if you're in your t-shirts like I usually am. And you are muted. Don't know how to unmute you. I will figure that out somewhere during this talk, but in the meantime, what you can do is just put your questions in the chat, so we'll all be able to see that. Climate change. I'm so excited about this topic because climate change is having such a serious impact on Florida and everywhere else around the country and the world, as we can see. But in Florida, it's impacting tourism, real estate, agriculture, our fishing industries, and not to mention our insurance rates. Oh my God, they've more than doubled in a year alone. So I was going to show you the front page of yesterday, I think it is, Herald Tribune, about the insurance rates. I mean, and the special legislation that is, the legislature's meeting in a special session to address it this week. But these impacts, you know, they're from the sea level rises, they're from all the severe storms we're seeing, the hurricanes. The National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, projects that sea levels are going to rise to be 10 to 14 inches for the East Coast and 14 to 18 inches for the Gulf Coast by 2050. Miami and its surrounding areas is the economic ground zero for climate impact. And it has been said to have the greatest value of assets at risk in the world. Number one. New York's number 3, by the way. Anyway, we need a healthy planet, a healthy environment, so that we have a healthy economy, as we can see. Well, we're here tonight to share with you some of the facts and challenges. We believe that the issue is urgent, but I don't want to be all doom and gloom. It is solvable. And these panelists will share with you some of the positive happenings here in Florida and around the world. Technology, entrepreneurial efforts, and the collaboration of our people will help immensely to overcome these challenges. So here's some food for thought to kick us off. This is the 2022 Davos Davos. I'm sorry. I have Davos in Michigan, so I got to get to the right last names. World Economic Forum's report, and it's showing the top 10 most critical global risks over the next 10 years. Take a look at them. 5 of those are the ones in green. They're all environmental. So it's a big issue. So with that food for thought, I am going to turn it over to Alex, who's going to start us off on some high-level investigation on climate science and the global warming. Alex, all yours.
Thank you very much, Beth. I think you can see my PowerPoint presentation screen. Yeah. All right. Great. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I thought we would start by just covering some of the basics about climate change. And some of you may already know about this, but some of you could use probably some added information on what really causes climate change. So we are, through most of our activities, I would say modern activities, we are putting carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere. That basically produces a thin layer of gases that prevent the sun radiation from going back into space and trapping that radiation inside the atmosphere, which is what produces global warming. So if you talk about in terms of concentration of gases, for the past several millennia, we have been hovering around 300 parts per million. And we are currently over 400 parts per million. And we call it CO2 equivalent because there are really 6 types of greenhouse gases that will produce the global warming effect. But the most prevalent, about 79% of it, is composed of CO2. So we talk about CO2 equivalent. And where do those gases come from? They come from a wide range of activities. We, as we know, live in a hydrocarbon society. We depend on oil for most things that we do and for most products that we currently have. So the challenge is really how to transition from a high carbon setup, if you will, to a lower carbon setup where we are really emitting less carbon into the atmosphere. But it comes from a variety of activities, from industrial processes to transportation and fertilization, forest burning, agriculture, landfills, and those that are most relevant in Florida, I would say, are the transportation sector and the commercial and residential cooling. I'm talking about the energy that it takes to keep buildings going, basically. And those two together can account over 50 to 60% of the greenhouse gases, if not more, that we have in Florida. Of course, some agriculture as well, and some methane from landfills. All of those contribute to what we call the global warming effect, the greenhouse gas effect. There are several frameworks that are being used to address the issue because global warming comes from just about everything that we do as a human species. Finding solutions for global warming is not only about putting, solar panels on top of your house or driving electric cars. It touches just about every single facet of life that we know. One such framework that is being used more and more is the drawdown framework. And they have clumped activities together, and they have classified those basically in three major areas on what we should do to address climate change. One is to reduce the sources. And from sources, again, we're talking about electricity generation, food, agriculture, industry, transport, buildings. And then at the same time, again, it's not only about addressing one of them, it's about addressing a plethora of aspects about our everyday living that will result in a lower carbon society. So while reducing the sources of emissions, we need to support the sinks, the carbon sinks, as we call them, which are those measures that will basically allow for the capturing of CO2. And those have to do with, for example, land use. We have a great amount of degraded land that we can change the use in our global landscape. The shift of agriculture practices. Agriculture is a major emitter of greenhouse gases. Just so you have an example, one of the main gases that are emitted by agriculture is nitrous oxide, which happens to be 273 times more potent than CO2 in terms of global warming potential. So it is a very prevalent, let's say, issue with agriculture. And then the protection and the restoration of ecosystems. And then finally, a third category are those measures that will improve society in general, such as health and education. So that's what we had in terms of the basics of climate change, where it comes from, and how we should look at the issue. And with that, I would like to turn it back to Beth.
Thank you. Thank you. One of the questions you just mentioned that nitric oxide from agriculture is one of the major contributors. Do you want to talk a little bit about where that's coming, how it's used in agriculture and where it's coming from?
Sure. Nitrous oxide is because nitrogen is used a lot in agriculture as a substance that fixates the nutrients that the plants need. You have the generation of nitrous oxide just by the extensive use of nitrogen, but also other activities that you have in the farm will generate nitrous oxide. So it's really prevalent in agriculture in general.
Thank you. And then, by the way, for those of you who would like to learn more about climate science and all the impacts, etc., we have a PBS documentary link that you're going to find in the chat. Thank you, Dolores, from PBS for providing this exclusive access. So we really appreciate that. Alex, can you share at this point, for those of you who have questions, please pop them in the chat. And but Alex, can you share some of your recent projects that help to accomplish a client's sustainable development type of goals?
Sure. The positive side of this is that the not so positive side is that it's a huge problem. it affects just about everything that we do. The positive side of this equation is that it's also a huge opportunity. And there are lots of things that are being done to address climate change, right? Just to give you a few examples, Beth, in South Florida, there are 3 initiatives, but that's just only 3 out of dozens of activities that are being done in order to address climate change. One of them actually happens to take place across the street from where I am at the University of Miami. It's called carbon biocapture, which is a point source algae-based carbon technology or carbon capture technology that is being perfected. It's actually originally Chilean technology that came to Miami. And what they do is they capture the emissions from factories that are rich in CO2 and other gases. They run those emissions through a farm of algae, basically. You know, these are plaques of algae, and the algae will eat up those gases, and then it will absorb, depending on the industry, about 86 to 90% of the global warming gases. And then not only that, but the byproduct that comes out of that process can be used in the industry, which really speaks to circularity. So with one solution, you can absorb industry emissions, and you can turn that into input to other industries. So that's a fabulous technology, and it's in the carbon capture realm. Another one is the Climate Coin, which is basically a digital carbon assets company with a mission to finance sustainable projects and scale up carbon markets. They're basically using blockchain to create, to tokenize, if you will, carbon emissions in a way that any investor can buy carbon credits, and by buying carbon credits, they are supporting sustainable projects. Basically, it's a latest generation financial mechanism and technology mechanism to provide liquidity. In other words, to finance sustainable development projects, and more specifically, projects that have to do with the absorption of carbon. And that's why they generate carbon credits. And finally, a third example is Okeanos, which uses a calcium carbonate technology from a stone to substitute plastic and decrease carbon footprint. That is something that is very significant because, as many of you know, plastics come from hydrocarbons, basically comes from oil. At the minute that you are able to produce packaging without needing plastic or without needing oil, you are automatically addressing a source of emissions, not only of carbon dioxide, but also methane that comes from the oil and gas exploration. And all of this is being done in our very own South Florida. So that's why climate is such an intractable problem, but also represents a huge opportunity for entrepreneurs and investors. Back to you, Beth.
All right, thank you, Alex. You know, for bringing us more understanding. I'd love to hear these examples. They're so cool. You know, so as we're talking about climate change, I mentioned to you about the sea level rise and the worsening storms. You know, we saw that there might be more storms this year or hurricanes than past years. We know the cost of them, the excessive heat. I mean, it is warmer than ever at this time of year, you know, today down here, and the humidity, oh my gosh. All this lowers our quality and quantity of the drinking water that we have available. The Everglades, we've heard this forever, and we know this, the Everglades plays such a critical role in the relationship of all these matters. And Ellen Goetz, as vice chair of the Everglade Foundation, is a perfect choice to share with us the value of the Everglades and explain how sea rise and agriculture have an impact on our state's drinking water. And I think she has this big announcement too. So Ellen, why don't you tell us more about the foundation, its mission, and your 11-year participation?
Thanks so much, Beth. Yes. So what is this, me and the Everglades? You know, I moved here in the mid 80s, and I think I had the typical relationship with the Everglades, which was, it was this little 2-lane road that I would take from Naples over to the chugging metropolis of Miami to get my cafe con leche and my nightlife. And it was wet, it was mysterious, it was mosquito-y, it was unknown. I had no clue what its function had been for millennia in this part in the world. So about 10 years ago, I got involved with the Everglades Foundation, but this is real interesting. In 1947, the Everglades was declared a national park. It was also the same year that a woman, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, wrote The Everglades, River of Grass, a seminal work that called out the critical need to protect the Everglades way back in 1947. And even then, we had distorted the plumbing of the state of Florida so radically that she knew that this was going to be a problem. The issue is very complex, just like Florida. It involves politics, it involves money, it involves greed. It is a remarkable drama, but it is something that is very positive in terms of what the restoration process, which is underway, can do for climate and for Florida moving forward. And Beth talked about the drinking water. The Everglades is the source for drinking water for 9 million Floridians in South Florida, because the Biscayne Aquifer, which is this big spongy limestone thing that pulsates underneath Miami and the East Coast, is fed by Everglades water. So I'm going to go through a little story of try to explain the complexity of it very simply, and then at the end talk about why this restoration project actually is very positive. And has good things for our future. So let's see. Interesting.
Do you need Alex to pull up the
There we-
slides, or
Alex, do you have them?
I
do.
emailed them to you?
Happy to.
All
Yep.
right, would you mind? Because for some reason, they've disappeared.
I don't mind.
Okay.
Let me know if you can see them.
I see the Zoom. So that
You see the
might
Zoom?
be-
No, that's not what we want.
That might be Ellen. So Ellen, you either have to pull it up or stop sharing.
Okay. Stop share. There we go.
Yeah,
Okay.
okay. Let me see.
You always expect some technical difficulties here. So
Yes.
There we go.
Technology is wonderful when it works. Can you
Thank you,
all
Alex.
see
This is
the
great.
presentation? Yeah,
So this is a photo of the Everglades taken by a talented young Floridian named Max Stone, who's a National Geographic photographer, and he happens to sit on the board of the Everglades Foundation with me. And he has chronicled the vast, mysterious beauty of this enormous system. The foundation was started years ago by two fishing buddies who lived in the Florida Keys and were taken aback by these dreadful algae blooms that were affecting their fishing. They had no idea at the time the enormity of the challenge. And so today, some 30 years later, the Everglades Foundation is the only nonprofit that is focused solely on restoring the Everglades through science, advocacy, and education. It is something, it's a very diverse board. I'm very privileged to be part of it. Most people have come to it from all diverse backgrounds, whether it's outdoors, fishing, music. We even have Jimmy Buffett on our board, a great Floridian. If you could go to the next slide, Alex. This is a graphic that shows the problem. On the left is how water flows today after we've distorted it for about 100 years. And the blue hole in the middle is the big Lake Okeechobee, which has a big dike around it, because in the 30s, a terrible flood killed thousands of Floridians that lived south of the lake. So Herbert Hoover told the Army Corps of Engineers, build that dike. And this caused the natural sheet flow that had once gone through Lake Okeechobee, overflowed the banks of Lake Okeechobee, and then seeped down through the Everglades, all the way down to Florida Bay in the bottom of the slide, was cut off. And the two brown areas, east and west, that's how water flows today. It is forced to go out two rivers, the Caloosahatchee to my coast and the St. Lucie to the Atlantic. And very little of the sheet flow is allowed to flow out of Lake Okeechobee and go south. And when it does flow nowadays, it has to go through those little skinny blue lines or all these man-made canals that dried up the half of the Everglades, so that agriculture, so that sugar and other crops can be grown south of the lake. And it has caused enormous problems with the Everglades not getting enough water, and Florida Bay then not being able to function as a natural water body. On the right, this is the goal. This is, see those big fat arrows and that big broad expanse of green. There is a range of projects, some 60 projects that are all man-made projects to try to duplicate the flow of sheet flow across the Everglades in an Everglades that's half the size of what it was originally. The next slide. And now this is a more detailed view of the state of Florida. And you can see through the darker green that the headwaters of the Everglades stretch all the way up to Orlando. And through a series of lakes and rivers, the watershed flows into Lake Okeechobee through the Everglades, what is called the agricultural area now, where they grow sugar and other crops. And then way down at the bottom, you can see Everglades National Park. And you can see how small it is compared to those earlier slides that had this, well, you can see how small it is to the entire watershed. The distortion of this natural water flow has resulted in several big environmental issues that have come to the fore very strongly in the last couple of years, sadly. But sometimes when you do have crises, you get action. And I think that's what has happened in the history of the Everglades. There's been more progress in the last 5 years than there probably were in the 12 years before that. So the three most important issues are, and I'm sure you've heard of toxic blue-green algae. It is, there's legacy phosphorus in Lake Okeechobee from old agricultural practices that brought the fertilizers that Alex talked about into Lake Okeechobee, where they still sit today. And this encourages the growth of an algae that we call guacamole. You can see how thick and gooey it is. It's actually toxic. There's been studies that show it has effects on human beings' neurosystems. And that polluted water is being flowed out to the Gulf of Mexico and to the Atlantic in a toxic form. There is red tide in saltwater bodies. It's naturally occurring, but in the last couple of years, you've seen on the news these dreadful images of thousands of dying porpoise, dolphin and manatees and fish, because the red tide, we now know, is being fed by the toxic blue-green algae. And so when red tide is present in either the Gulf or the Atlantic, it is kept alive by this flowing toxic green algae. It's just an incredible situation. So that's one of those terrible problems. And then the one I alluded to in the beginning is what started the foundation in the first place. The seagrass doesn't get enough fresh water as it mixes down in Florida Bay and in other estuaries. So it collapses. And an acre of seagrass holds as much carbon as an acre of rainforest. So it's an enormous carbon sink. And you also probably saw in the news this year how 1,000 manatees died last year from starvation because they don't have any seagrass to eat because of it. So Everglades restoration is designed to help fix all of these problems. Yeah, okay. So the concept behind restoration has long been agreed to by scientists. This big reservoir was called for in a massive plan that was approved by Congress and signed into law by President Clinton in December of 2000. And Florida is unique in that restoration projects in Florida are a joint partnership between the federal government and the state. That's very unique. Usually it's either one or the other, not both. But it's been since 2000 when they signed this legislation, and we're still not finished on these projects. And so what's the problem? What the big problem has been that there was an act that called for this 50-50 split. And there's been a terrible seesaw between the feds and the state of Florida over the years and arguments about who funds what. In most years, Washington actually failed to match Tallahassee's commitment to restoration. And that caused Everglades advocates to go to both capitals, Tallahassee and DC, and lobby for restoration. In 2017, Governor Rick Scott signed legislation that identified the state land would be used south of the lake for a massive reservoir project, and that set that in motion. Then we had great leadership on the part of Florida when the Senate and Senate President Joe Negron enacted a bill that funded the Florida part of this reservoir. He lived on the Treasure Coast, which was plagued by algae. It was in his backyard. He was in politics for 15 years, and he was sick of these fish kills and these beaches and the whole nightmare that he lived through and his voters lived through. So he moved that project forward. There is now a 10,500 acre reservoir that is planned south of the lake, and a separate constructed wetland that will clean this nutrient rich water as it moves from the reservoir so it can safely go into the Everglades. When it's completed, it will store 78 billion gallons at any time, enough to lower its level by the Lake Okeechobee's level by ½ a foot. The reservoir is planned to be 23 feet deep. It would hold enough water for over 100,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So the thing is huge. Together with other projects throughout the state, this will significantly reduce this algae causing discharge into the Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie rivers. And it will allow that this clean, fresh water will flow into the parched Everglades and Florida Bay every year. Now the state that owns the land has spent $309 million since 2017 in taking the lead to build a stormwater treatment area for the project. And the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers faces a much bigger task of constructing the reservoir itself at a cost of more than $3 billion. While the state's on track to complete its share of this job next year, the Corps estimates that the reservoir will only be done by 2029, and the federal spending this year, President Biden's 2023 budget requests included $400 million for Everglades restoration projects, and the majority of which is directed towards this big reservoir. And this would be the largest single year federal spending request for Everglades restoration since that plan was enacted in 2010. I'm sorry, in 2000. Okay, Alec, what slide are we on? We're on the, yeah. So
We're on the very last slide.
we're on the very last slide. So what I wanted to talk about here is why climate change? Why does this impact climate change? The carbon that's stored in these peat soils in the massive Everglades system will be protected by rehydrating the Everglades. And it's a 3 million acre ecosystem that is affected by this flow of water back into a parched landscape. The other interesting effect is that by hydrating the Everglades with fresh water, that prevents saltwater intrusion into South Florida wells, especially on the east coast of Florida. So the fresh water acts like a huge buffer against letting saltwater come through. Right now, the Everglades is starved. It's not getting the right amount of water. So saltwater is intruding into wells from the Atlantic Ocean. And again, that's the water supply for 9 million Floridians. The other thing that the Everglades does is it provides storm surge resilience because mangroves are a very valuable buffer along our coast. And I think everyone's familiar with that, but they stabilize the shoreline, they reduce flooding from storm surges, and they protect these habitats that are all involved in restoration. And the thing that Marjorie Stoneman Douglas wrote in 1947, it couldn't be probably more true today. And she said, the Everglades is a test. If we pass it, we may get to keep the planet. And she said that in 1947. So you can see that how critical this restoration project is, and how hopeful it is that we've got both the state and the federal governments working together. And I also like to joke that, you know, the Everglades is the only place in the world where crocodiles and alligators coexist. So there's great argument for the bipartisan nature and the bipartisan approach to restoration that the Everglades has enjoyed for these last 22 years. So Beth, did you?
Yeah, thank you, Ellen.
Yeah.
We're going to try and stay on time here. So we're not going to take questions for Ellen right now, since we're running out of time. However, talk to all the panelists and they can all stay on after 7 o'clock. So we're going to continue through the program. And then after 7, if you have any additional questions for Ellen or any of our other panelists, we'll stay on for a little while so that you can ask them. So with that, I am going to start to turn it over to the next speaker, because so we've heard about how vital the Everglades are. But recently there was a conference in Miami Beach. It was sponsored by the Aspen Institute and the city of Miami Beach. And it focused on climate change and what can be done. Well, we have a guest speaker from the Aspen Institute of the takeaways from this important conference. And Alex, I'm turning it over to you to do the big introduction.
Oops, I was on mute. Thank you very much, Beth. And it's my pleasure to introduce the audience to Pablo Angulo Trocones, Advocacy Manager at the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs, a program of the Aspen Institute. Pablo was significantly involved in the Miami Climate Change Conference for the Institute. A number of the world's most ambitious climate problem solvers from across the US and beyond participated in this major event in Miami Beach, a city that is facing the daily effects of sea level rise, intensifying storms, and weather shifts. But Miami Beach is also a locus of innovation and adaptation in the face of the crisis. Miami Beach and Miami-Dade County, I'm happy to say, are making many necessary changes to enhance their resilience. Pablo has joined us today to share the takeaways with the group, what we have learned from the conference, Aspen Ideas Climate. So Pablo, the Aspen Ideas Climate Conference focused upon 4 tracks of discussion and possible solutions: Earth on Offense, Resilient Communities, Climate Smart Money and Clean Power, and Bright Future. Would you be able to walk us through the main takeaways from those areas during the conference? Because I think it's highly relevant to our discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alex, and thank you for the kind introduction. I think it was Ruth at the beginning that mentioned that I was the mystery guest today, so I think I've never been labeled as such, and that's I'm happy take that label and probably use it in my bio for the future. So really excited to be here, and thank you for the opportunity. So as you mentioned, I work for the Aspen Institute. I was recently in Miami Beach participating in the conference and planning some sessions there. Let me just quickly introduce myself and where I sit in the Aspen Institute and the work that I lead, and then go over to the conference itself. So you mentioned that I work for the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs, and that is a program, a policy program of the Aspen Institute. There are a number of different programs within the Aspen Institute, and they all collaborated and they worked in producing the conference, also with our team in Aspen, which is the logistical team for the conference itself, or for the Aspen Ideas Festival, which is part of a larger initiative. That Andy, which is essentially the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs that I work for, is a global network of organizations that propel entrepreneurship in developing economies. So I work on supporting small businesses and supporting what we call small and growing businesses. And the growing there is an important description, because we support small businesses that have a growth orientation. Because we believe in market-based solutions and the capacity of the small businesses to create jobs, stimulate long-term economic growth, and also provide climate solutions. And I lead our advocacy work, and the premise of our advocacy work is that small businesses are climate solutions providers, yet they are not considered as such. And they are climate solutions providers because they either innovate, they're either providing this innovation that you were talking about, Alex, previously. Many entrepreneurs do that, and they either are innovating with those solutions, or they are either bringing tested solutions to untested markets. So that's why we want small businesses and small and growing businesses to be recognized as such. On the flip side, small businesses need to be supported towards a just transition and sustainable practices. They're essentially very different from a large company, but yet they are lumped into the category of private sector, and their needs are very different. So they need to be supported. And if you look at the statistics, and small businesses are 90% of the world's companies. They produce around 40–50% of global GDP. In the US alone, 80% of enterprises and companies are small and medium enterprises. So we advocate for more funding, more capital to go to, and more climate finance to go to the small businesses. So, but so that was a little bit of the work that I do, but let me go to the Ideas Festival. So it took place 2 weeks ago, from May 9 to May 12th. And let me start with some 3 takeaways, general takeaways, and then I'll go into the specific tracks that you mentioned. So first takeaway is the urgency of now. I think we've heard it from you, Alex, and you know, I think that climate change is here. Climate change is here to stay. We need to throw everything that we have at it: capital, science, politics, innovation, technology, personal action. And of course, climate conversations can be a little bit depressing at times. And I hope to finish with some positive outlook here, but it is true that we're in a better position than we were previously to the Paris Agreement. Unfortunately, we're not yet on a pathway to avoid or to stay on an increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial level. We're still not doing enough. Even with all the commitments and all the pledges, we're still not doing enough. And that was a very, very strong outcome of the conference, that we are not doing enough, and there we need to do more. But I think the conference was great at bringing together everybody: politicians, private sector, academia, government representatives, entrepreneurs, civil society, union, artists. They were all there, chefs. They were all there, and climate change was explored from absolutely every possible angle. And I was very excited to hear all the amazing things that are happening. That's why, even though the conversation was at times depressing, I got to be honest, it was also exciting in certain occasions. And like I said, I'll finish with that. But so I think the other element, the other second takeaway, is that climate change can also be a unifying force across the political divide. We tend to see climate change as this polarizing topic in the US, particularly at the national level, but it doesn't have to be this way. It has been made political because there were vested interests in making it a political issue. But I was very excited to see how in Miami it's a unifying force. You have mayors, you know this better than I do. You have mayors from the two parties represented in Miami-Dade, Miami Beach, and yet they come together around climate change and all the work they have to do around climate change. And I think that this was very good. And I think that it's also the capacity that the Aspen Institute has to provide and to bring and to convene people from different angles and see how we are approaching solutions. And I am reminded on that element, two particular points. One was made by Mayor Suarez about the semantics and how, for example, he mentioned how when you talk about climate change, people have a harder capacity to relate to the concept of climate change than if you, for example, say floods. And it's because, and Miami and Florida to a certain extent as well, are more sensitive to climate change issues than other states in the US. And obviously Florida is the state with the most risks when it comes to climate risks. So this affects people's lives directly, and therefore it's a unifying force as opposed to a divisive force. But I'm also reminded of the director of the Yale program of climate change communication also talked about a study that they did and framed it as 6 different Americas, or the opinion of Americans around climate change. So 33% of Americans are alarmed about climate change, 25% are concerned, 17% are cautious, 5% are disengaged, 10% are doubtful, and only 9% are dismissive. And he talked about how we shouldn't clarify, we shouldn't talk about, the positions on climate change in just 2 camps, climate believers and climate deniers. But he was talking that the ones that essentially just think climate change is a hoax, for example, is just only 9% of Americans think that way and are dismissive. But it's a loud 9%. But many people are engaged around the topic and want action. So that's the second takeaway that I wanted to mention to you. The other one is, the third takeaway is around climate security and energy security. Ukraine featured heavily in the discussions. It was mentioned a couple of times that our addiction to fossil fuels are essentially financing Russia's war of aggression with Ukraine. And actually the effects that we're seeing of that is discouraging, because you're seeing greens or renewable energy plants put on hold, more subsidies for fossil fuels. But it is also the point, and there's a point that also was made by Jason Bordoff, a professor at the Climate School of Columbia University, about how, for example, in early 2020, conservative security policy thinkers and environmental NGOs came together, very different parts of the political spectrum, came together to lobby Congress to curb oil, to curb oil use in the U.S. because 2/3 of our oil was being imported. So it was considered a national security threat and an environmental threat at the same time. So that's why they were brought together. And I think the point of climate change being both a climate security and an energy security, and how it becoming a climate security, or a national security threat is very strong, came out very strong. And it was a point further maintained. For example, there was a session by Paul Harmon, which is the principal deputy assistant secretary of the Army, and they were talking about precisely all the changes that they're seeing, and all they have actually, the Army has a climate strategy. So again, it's another big point that was mentioned. So let me take you to the different tracks, and just pointing out that the different tracks also obviously make it easier for us to understand, but you could also make an argument that these separations are artificial. If we think of all this in the perspective of systems that need to work together, they're all interconnected. The same with, a common description of mitigation and adaptation as two separate things when they're essentially, when you look at this, they're essentially the same thing. So these are a little bit artificial, but they were made just for knowledge's sake. And Earth on Offense was essentially, you saw several sessions talking about the use of the power of nature or Earth ecosystem and systems thinking to address climate change. So that nature has a capacity of healing itself, and how can we use the nature to heal itself and promote that healing. So it also means nature-based solutions, and how we can utilize what nature has to support or to tackle climate change. So you had sessions around floods and innovation, the ocean being a large carbon sink and how it's not considered a natural carbon sink, yet it's an important carbon sink. And you had sessions on indigenous knowledge. And there were several indigenous people in the conference as well within the US, sharing their knowledge and their approach to living in harmony with nature, and how can that be tapped to find climate solutions. So that was an important perspective there. The other one is climate smart money. This is essentially the role of private sector, corporate leaders, entrepreneurs, investors, philanthropists, and what everybody has to do. I mean, one of the things that you've seen, for example, recently is more engagement of the private sector, more private capital, but also pledges, not just greening their own operations, but also making pledges of funding for particular climate change initiatives. So you had sessions around what is sustainable investing and how to do sustainable investing, how to drive corporate action, philanthropy, the role of private equity, and the role of entrepreneurship, which is my domain. And there were a few sessions where entrepreneurs would pitch ideas for funders, and they were trying to raise capital. I'll come back to that at the end, but that was around the session of climate money. And then Clean Power, Bright Future, which is essentially the program tack around energy. I think you mentioned this at the beginning, Alex, that fossil fuel consumption in the US is, I think you mentioned it from Florida, but in the US, it comes from, our main fossil fuel consumption comes from our transportation and our electricity grid, and almost 75% of greenhouse emissions come from these two sectors alone in the US. So there were sessions about, how do we support nuclear? Is nuclear the option or the real option that we need to decarbonize and to provide electricity? How to decarbonize the electricity sector? As you know, whether if some of it comes from renewables, but it's mostly from burning fossil fuels. How to decarbonize the shipping industry? These are very hard sectors to decarbonize, and there are sessions on that particularly. I'll put at the end some of the links to the sessions. Some of the sessions have been uploaded on YouTube for everybody to see. Not all of it has been uploaded, but I'll put the link so you can see. I would like to recommend one session from where the CEO of the Florida Power and Light was interviewed, and he talks about the journey that FPL has taken, leaving fossil fuels and shutting down coal plants and refurbishing nuclear plants. And his perspective, I am not very familiar with Florida policy or politics, but his perspectives on the Florida net metering bill and rooftop solar and so on. But it's a great conversation, so I'll post the link to that for everybody to see. And then a session where I was involved, or a program type where I'm mostly involved in, which is the one built resilient communities. And as the title says, it's talking about how to build resilience within communities directly. For example, if you look at most recent IPCC reports, the body that looks at climate change at a UN level, they argued that climate change is already baked in. So that means that we need to adapt. We need to plan and adapt to more recurrent extreme weather events. And some sessions within this program talked about climate justice, decarbonizing this whole system, how are cities coping, and a lot of talk around what Miami is doing and the resilience efforts, and how they recently, I think it was recently appointed a chief heat officer, which is I think an uncommon position. It's great that it's happening. It's an uncommon position within the public sector, or how rural parts of the US are tackling climate change. we had a session called Big Ideas from the Front Lines. And essentially, it was a session that tried to look at options or solutions to extreme weather events. And we brought 3 panelists to that session. We had an entrepreneur from India who has a organic foods company, and how she taught. I think someone is unmuted. I'll just continue. And I know that I'm almost out of time, so I'll try to wrap up with my points here. And so the session that we were doing was called Big Ideas from the Frontline. It was again a solutions focus session on extreme weather events, and we had the entrepreneur from India who talked about how she supports smallholder farmers, how first they're being affected by climate change, but how she supports smallholder farmers in India. And then we had the former minister of Costa Rica, national planning, economic policy, and her perspectives on how do you ingrain resilience within public policy. And then we had a youth advocate from Alaska, who was an indigenous youth advocate who was very, very vocal about how climate change is affecting fishing communities in Alaska, and very vocal about the need to include those communities in the answer to climate change. So that was our session, and those sessions revolved around that, but you had other sessions that I think were amazing. I mean, there was a session with 3 mayors from Miami-Dade, Daniela Levin Cava, Mayor Francis Suarez, and Mayor from Miami Beach, Dan Gilbert. Those were amazing sessions. I'll post a link. It was talking about Miami's vision. And then there were also other couple sessions. It was a great site visit. We went to the Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Science, where I was able to see in action the SUSTAIN laboratory, which is the largest laboratory in the world that can reproduce 5 hurricane category 5 wind speeds, and how that is used for foresight and forecasting and evacuation and early warning mechanisms. So like I said, most of these sessions could be a little bit depressing, but I don't want to end on a depressing note. There was a great session with entrepreneurs, which I'll post the link to. And if you ever get depressed hearing about climate change, the best thing to cure that depression is to listen to the entrepreneurs and what they're doing. So there are sessions like I was saying, and I was listening, I'm just mentioning 3. There was this entrepreneurship company called Leven Seawalls, which essentially with 3D printing, they create seawalls that are both, barriers, seawalls, but at the same time, they're created to host local marine life. And there was another one called Renewal, which I think was incredibly creative. They use oil wells that are decommissioned for energy storage. And I think that was a great understanding of both the engineering and the innovation, but also the economics, because there is simply no incentive for example, for oil companies where oil wells are being decommissioned to actually decommission them properly. So this company, this entrepreneur, tried to address that particular problem. And there was another one called CallWave, where they try to use wave energy to generate electricity. Wave energy is really hard to tackle, to grasp, to use to generate electricity. And that was a great company, or a great presentation from the different entrepreneurs. I'll stop there, Alex. Again, I'll post all the links that I mentioned in the chat, but thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about this.
Thank you, Pablo. That was really informative, and it was kind of cool to hear you mention the Ruscamp Institute, because Fiona Crawford, who I just checked, she's not on the call at the moment, but she is an IWF sister of ours. She's the president and CEO of the Institute, and she is an active participant here in Sarasota. So I'm glad that you mentioned to them. And I can't wait to talk to you more about decarbonizing the shipping industry, because that one is a challenge. And I've seen a few types of examples of where they try to apply it, but great conversation on that. So it's 7:02. You finished like almost, we were supposed to finish at 7. So it's 7:02. As I told everybody, I realize that this is only till 7, but our panelists have agreed to stay on for a little bit longer. So if you have questions, pop them in the chat. And one of the ones that is in the chat that I was really interested in is what matrix can be used to show the effectiveness of small businesses and help attract some capital. So you were talking about small businesses and, some of them having the inventions. Well, there's two issues of that, actually. One is small businesses coming up with different innovative ideas. But in addition, when you have a small business and you're trying to figure out how you can lessen your footprint, how do you do that? And maybe what kind of incentives are out there for that, to maybe put in that green roof or the green wall or the, whatever it is, more permeable surfaces, etc. So that's a pretty open question. Go ahead, Pablo.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm looking at some of the questions that are coming on the chat and also on through the Q&A. And the metrics question, this is a great question because there is, I think there's, metrics are more standardized for private or large companies than they are for the small business sector. And that's something that we're trying to address. And we're trying to advocate for specific metrics that we're actually conducting our research internally already. And we're trying to collaborate with a couple of other climate folks to try to come up with some standardized metrics that could help small businesses show that effectiveness and attract capital. So I think, Lori, that's an amazing question. I don't think there's a concrete answer to that. Beyond that, we're trying to come up with those metrics and trying to promote and move the sector in that particular direction. On the flip side, I would promote maybe the work that the SME Climate Hub is doing. Essentially, they're using tools and they're creating tools to help the small businesses specifically to understand how to decarbonize and how to calculate their own greenhouse emissions. But I agree, Lori, the issue of metrics is essential to be able to show that small businesses are really effective and that green entrepreneurship, there's proof of concept and that really green entrepreneurship works. I see that there are a couple of other questions.
Well, did Alex, before we leave that one, Alex, did you want to jump in a little bit about attracting private capital and those types of topics?
Sure, happy to. There is a considerable amount of interest in the financial community for companies that not only don't do anything bad to the environment, hence climate change, but have regenerative business models. So companies that are actually addressing the issue and allowing us to crawl some of the damage done. So these companies, I would even venture to say that the bottleneck is not really the amount of capital, because there's great interest on the part of capital in companies that are addressing climate change. The bottleneck really is bankable projects and bankable, companies in general. So a lot of effort is spent nowadays preparing companies and projects to actually be bankable, basically helping those projects organize themselves so that they are able to get funding. Climate flows nowadays are around $630 billion a year, of which about 90% is flowing towards mitigation and 10% is flowing towards adaptation. Even though that amount is still short of what we need to have in order to keep to 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2100, it is not a small amount. So there is capital and there will be more capital going forward. So about those businesses, how can they attract capital? You basically have to put together ecosystems that support those businesses, especially those that point to regeneration of the ecosystems and the systems that we need to have in place.
Thank you. Now, there's an interesting comment in chat about Florida Power and Light and how can they consider themselves clean energy company when methane makes up 70% of their energy portfolio. But, and I know you have this with similar companies, you know, electric companies around the country, you know, when they have a lot of coal, you know, a lot of them are trying to change from coal to maybe a cleaner energy with coal. They're buying their wind farms, their or solar farms, and also converting some of them to nuclear energy. You know, it's hard because, as you say, they make up 70%. I'm not sure if this is the correct number, but assuming it is, how do you balance those two? Our need for electricity, our need for, you know, coal being cheap, but, you know, the issues we have with climate change, and what are they doing? And, you know, how can we call them clean? This is a politically charged question. So I don't know, Pablo, do you want to take that, or who wants to take that?
I'll just mention briefly that I posted the link to that session, and I encourage you to watch it and make your own conclusions. The interviewer was, you know, pressing, let's say politely, the CEO to answer that particular question, you know, that there can be a criticism that precisely that 70% of their energy comes from natural gas, and particularly their views on, you know, solar and all that. So I'm not too familiar with the topic enough to talk about the Florida Power and Light, but I'll just encourage you to watch the session, because I think it was a fascinating conversation, regardless of where you stay or where you agree or not.
If I may just jump in here for a second, I think that is one of the most important questions that we have nowadays in the energy transition. How to balance the short-term needs for cheap and plentiful energy, and the carbon emissions that the current energy system that we have produces. That a company may claim that it is green, or you know, what's the definition of greenwashing? Greenwashing is to, you know, my definition is to try and derive a benefit from saying that you're green, when you may not be that green. So, but that's a very important question nowadays, and there are initiatives that are actually defining what are green activities, what activities are considered truly green, and what activities are not considered green. But back to the energy issue, it's so crucial, and the Ukraine war, as Pablo mentioned earlier, is putting a spotlight on the issue of energy and what's the right balance. The reality is that we're going to need fossil fuels for a long time, and it's going to be part of the energy matrix. The question is how quickly we have to transition.
All right, thank you. It's 7:12. I think we've answered all the questions on the chat. So we obviously have lots of other questions on this, but I don't want to take anybody else's time. Panelists, this was great. We thank you so much for all your input and everything. You know, this is a huge issue. It's a frightening issue, but I think we've only touched about some of the ways that we can solve it. And the bottom line is it is solvable. It's solvable for everyone on an individual level, from bringing your own bags to the grocery store so that you don't use as much petroleum, you know, plastic bags, and you know, just your own water bottles, to using more permeable surfaces to the communities in how they're planning things, national government, and, including the funding to help with, address some of these issues, the NGOs, the private sector, lots of options for us to do. So I think this really hopefully opened a lot of your eyes. But before we leave, I have to do the thank yous. First, I want to thank all of our speakers. They put in so much time. Ruth Brophy, I'm sorry, I have to call you out because, you haven't really talked that much, but you were just unbelievable. Really, she has been, pushing this and driving us and making sure we get this all done. And so thank you. Ellen, Alex, Pablo, really great. And we'll try and get your contact information and, so it's available to people. And then I need to thank, first of all, the presidents of the forum, Danette and Lucy, Danette Linares and Lucy Lepotsky, who are both on this call. Thank you for your leadership, your invaluable support, it really takes a lot of effort to be a chapter president, and we really appreciate you. We appreciate the collaboration and the, doing this together, 2 chapters. That's really cool. And our events committees, because, it is a lot of work. And really, some of the glue is our administrators. Tanya Epsengraf for the West Coast, and then Leah Cerdito, who is the East Coast administrator. You two, thank you for making this happen. Leah's on actually the call to make sure we didn't mess up, but they're behind the scenes and work so importantly for us. So thank you, everybody. And this should be on the websites. And if I'm wrong about that, I know that somebody will correct me real quickly. So that's it. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.